This episode is sponsored by Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I'm Matt.
I'm Kerry.
We are the Stagmer brothers of Baltimore Knife and Sword. We're going to be building some of your favorite weapons, and some weapons that you've never seen before.
This is Man-at-Arms, REFORGED.
The Assassin's Creed franchise has taken us all over the globe throughout many different time periods. And this time, we get to explore ancient Greece to see what combat really would have been like for our ancient Spartan warrior. We're not only going to be making one weapon, we're going to make two. The legendary Broken Spear of Leonidas and the Kopis, which is one of the most lethal single-edged curved swords in all of history. After we build these weapons today, we're going to be sending them off to Smosh Games, where after they do their playthrough of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, they're going to be doing a choreographed fight scene to really show how these weapons would have been used. During this time period, most weapons would have been made out of iron. We're going to be making both weapons out of iron, but we're going to add a steel edge forge welded on both pieces, giving them much more keen, sharp cutting edges.
To begin the forging on the spear, I first select a piece of wrought iron. I heat it up and create a nub, which I will use to manipulate the piece with tongs. Then I cut off that piece. This will become the socket for the spear. To make the socket, I flatten it out, giving it a triangular shape. This will assist in wrapping that socket around a mandrel. Normally with spears, you should have a tapered socket. That is so because when you use the spear, it drives itself onto the shaft rather than falling off. The other reason is when you forge weld a spear socket, the mandrel has to be tapered so that it would not get stuck. After the socket is roughly formed, I begin forging on the spearhead portion. For that I use the same piece of wrought iron. I clip it off and flatten it out somewhat, giving it a triangular section with a swell at the base. Then I select a piece of steel which will be wrapped around the edge of the spear. Remember, iron has very poor edge retention, but steel has very good edge retention. So combining steel and iron is the best plan to making a high quality spear.
For the handle of our Kopis, I'm going to use a polymer clay, which can be oven hardened, and begin to form a shape in the rough dimensions of the handle. Then I'm going to refine it, sculpt it down a little bit, and then I'll bake the portion before any details are put on to get the final form of the serpent.
It's now time to forge weld our high carbon edge to the wrought iron body of the spear. Ilya first moves to the anvil and initially does the weld by hand, but later moved to the power hammer to finish the welds and finish drawing out the shape.
So I've poured a mold for the Kopis handle that Rick sculpted. What I did is I just cut the blade that he was working from and left the tang inside. The advantage of that is that I'm going to use this metal piece that I created as my mother mold. So when I pour the wax, I'll be pouring the wax around that metal tang. When we take the wax out, we'll already have the hole that we need. It'll leave that cavity where we need to have the new blade set in. But also to create the proper mold, as I cut through with the scalpel, I'll be making some zigzags going up and down. That way the mold only goes back together one way, it stays registered, and I can clamp it when I pour the waxes. I won't have big seam lines.
high carbon now welded as one, it's time to draw out the spear to its final length and width. Now that Ilya is happy with the shape of the spear, he's going to turn it over and draw out the tank portion that will be forge welded into our socket.
So I've now poured wax into the mold. You saw us take the original out, leaving that hollow cavity. I was going to take that tank section out and place it back in the mold to create the cavity. I ended up not being able to take it out of the original sculpt without breaking it. We really like the sculpt that Rick made, so we've decided to keep it. So I went ahead and I used that as my pour spot. I just created a spout right here and an air vent down farther, which you'll see as I begin to take it apart. Now that the wax is cooled, I'm going to go ahead and take this apart and see what we have and how much work we have to do to clean up the wax before we invest it. It is exactly what we need. We'll be able to cast this. I'll cut this out. We'll drill this wax out before we get it into bronze. Make sure that that tang fits up inside for the sword, and then we'll be casting this in bronze.
To forge weld our spear to our socket, Ilya is going to take the tang portion of the spear, insert it into the socket, and bend 2 tabs down on the side. He'll then return them to the forge, then bring them up to forge welding temperature. He'll start with small, slow taps and progressively swing harder and harder. Ilya noticed he needed to gain a little more width to the spear. That's no problem because he hasn't yet forged his bevels. With the spear now forged to shape, the socket attached, I've already moved on to doing some grinding. I used a 2-inch wheel to scoop away material back here and a little 1/2-inch wheel to get right underneath our hooks. Now it's time to move on to doing the perimeter and the actual edge grinding on our spear. I'm also going to clean up the socket, get that material as clean as possible before heat treat. After making his initial fold, Ilya has now prepped his material and is ready to start forging his blade. He's going to move to the Nazel power hammer and begin drawing out his material. You notice that he uses several top tools to create the very unique shape of the Kopis. Once he's got his material out to length, he uses a hot cut tool to cut off the tip at an angle. He then cools that little bit of excess on the tip and breaks it off. He can now forge the tip over, ensuring that his high carbon steel is at the point.
All right, Ilya did a fantastic job forging our Kopis blade. It's now my turn to start the grinding process. Basically, the first step I have to do is move along the perimeter and true up where each individual hammer blow kind of distorted the material. Get that all back nice and true. So I'm gonna start by using this rough belt here, and then I'm gonna have to put a very fresh belt on, and then I can move on to the tough part, and that's adding the huge hollow ground edge in. Basically, the entire surface is hollow ground, and then has a secondary bevel for the actual sharp cutting edge.
Even though the main body of this is iron and won't harden, since we have a high carbon steel center and down through the edge, heat treating is going to make a huge difference. Ilya is going to bring this to critical temperature, quench it, and then we'll have to take it through a temper. Ilya now brings the spearhead up to temperature and quenches. This will harden that outside edge. We'll have to temper to make sure that it's not fragile.
All right, our sword blade has now been heat treated and tempered, and it's time for its final grind. I'm gonna start by scuffing the flat surface of the blade on our 36 grit, and then move on to refining my hollow ground edge. And then I have to establish that secondary bevel that actually creates our sharp edge. All right, guys, the blade is now fully polished all the way out. I'm actually very proud of the grind on this blade. It was a pretty tricky challenge, and it was a lot of fun. That deep hollow, keeping that nice and even, making sure my flat is really distinct. I really love this blade, but the next step is to etch it for two reasons. First, we have to give it the aged look that it has as it appears in the game, and two, we want to see the distinct line that happens naturally between the wrought iron flats on the blade and the high carbon edge. Also, the wrought iron itself has a very natural, beautiful pattern. So we're gonna etch it in some ferric chloride for about 20 minutes until we're happy with the aged look, pull it out, and we're ready to mount it and finish the sword. So after we got our spearhead heat treated and tempered, I went ahead and ground some flats on the spear just into the socket. That's the portion where we're gonna be adding our bronze center part to the actual spear itself. But first, I have to do a lot of sculpting on the narrow wheel. I drew myself some guidelines with a marker. I have to follow those guidelines with the narrow wheel, sculpt them in, and then I have to work from those lines to the center
removing material until it looks just right.
Matt's going to take this large section of walnut and go ahead and go right to the sander. Sometimes we'll cut these shapes to form, but we use such aggressive belts on the sanders, he can just tear this material off and quickly get the form he needs for this handle.
So at this point, I've done all the finish grinding on the inside of the spear. Kerry CNC'd our collar portion, and Ilya heated it up, wrapped it around and attached it. Now we just have a few final details that we actually have to add to the socket, and I'm going to accomplish that with our narrow wheel.
Ilya now prepares to lay the bronze onto the spear. He's going to be producing small rivets to drive down through and hold the bronze directly on. This will work better than welding because we have a hardened edge, and so we're worried about heat. An artifact like this weapon wouldn't look right if it was brand new. Ilya's going to be adding some battle damage. He'll go through with this, cut it, refinish, and repolish. It's always quite a challenge to do multiple pieces in a build. In this case, since the blades have historic inspiration, we can do this type of work fairly quickly, but every time we do these builds, they come out different. I think this sword is really fantastic, but this spear is awesome. We want to thank Assassin's Creed Odyssey for sponsoring this episode. Assassin's Creed Odyssey, available everywhere October 5th.